And so I was doing a postdoc study kind of documenting insects, diseases, root disease, forest dynamics. And the summer of '94, a lot of the Boise burned, about a third of it. So after the Yellowstone fire was 1988, 1994 was the next big seminal fire year that everything changed, our understanding of fires. And I recall being out looking at some fires with Dr. Leon Neuenswander, who's kind of the grandfather of fire, fire ecologist, manager at the University of Idaho. And he said, you know, this is the first year in recent history, meaning the last 50 years, where 100-hour and 1,000-hour fuels were dictating fire behavior. Normally it's the fine fuels that dictate fire behavior. And so it really gave me a perspective after measuring forest conditions and seeing them burn and having the opportunity to go back and look at how they burned under those conditions really got me intrigued as to trying to figure out fire's role on the landscape. And also the role of forest management. You hear a lot of different sides to this. It's our past management that has created this scenario. It's climatic variability that has created this scenario, on and on. So now a seminal paper that came out many years ago that looked at fire histories on landscapes. And so a lot of fire history is based on fire scars. And fire scars are a great way to reconstruct fire, but they only tell you about fires where trees survived. If there are no trees that have fire scars, then you kind of have to guess. Was there no fire, or was it stand replacing fire, and when was it stand replacing fire? So the famous 1910 fires that burned 3 million acres are assumed to be in a stand replacing fire regime because they burned off all the trees with fire scars. So another way of looking at is Jennifer Pierce did some seminal work on the Boise where they looked at these alluvial fans, catastrophic fires that resulted in mass erosion events. And so they give us a history of when these larger landscape severe fires occurred. And so I just highlighted really the important essence of this, that fire-related sediments and burn-buried soil surfaces provide records of fire and geomorphic responses over millennial timescales, thousands of years. Records of fires preserved in alluvial fan sediments indicate widespread, likely severe fires occurred during past intervals of multi-decadal drought, 1,050 to 650 years before present. These fires occurred throughout a range of forest types. So these kind of fires that we're seeing now, we often hear that, oh, this is unique. Well, it's unique sort of in the last century. But we're dealing with ecosystems that sometimes take 1,000 years to cycle. I mean, consider that the Girard Larch Grove up Cecilia Lake, the old trees are close to 1,000 years old there. Okay? And one species doesn't define a forest ecotype, it's the successional pattern. So it might start out ponderosa pine that then converts to Doug fir, or it might start out with larch that then converts to western red cedar. And that entire cycle can sometimes be well over 1,000 years. And so the role of fire varies across those times. And so again, this is kind of the alluvial fans that Jennifer studied on the Boise National Forest, and through that determined that, you know, big fires were a normal part of history, but they coincide really well with dry climatic episodes. And the Holocene the last 12 to 13,000 years was anything but stable. Okay, now compared to the Ice Age, it was stable, but there were huge fluctuations during that time. And so when it's hot and dry, forests burn. When it's cool, wet, they regenerate and they spread. And then it's hot and dry, and then they shrink again. So it's this continually dynamic system that's happening out there. I'm going to go back to, again, then since 1994, then the Bitterroot Complex of 2000, 365,000 acres burned. And this is from Upper Laird Creek looking across this landscape. This, again, became a big learning period. And we were all scrambling. What do we do with this? What caused it? How do we recover out of it? And we saw interesting patterns on the landscape. And, you know, as an ecologist, patterns matter to me. They're really intriguing. And we saw things that consistently supported a lot of the ecological theory. So the more open forest with the big old ponderosa pines tended to survive the fire. And the dense Doug fir stands on north and east slopes that had contiguous dense crown fuels tended to burn as stand replacing fires. But one other thing that I started to see a lot, and I saw this on the Boise already back in '94, is that past clear cuts seemed not to burn readily. Okay, and so you see these obvious green squares on the landscape surrounded by black, and the question comes to mind, why didn't they burn? Because they're very dense, with a lot of little trees, because they were planted or regenerated very, very heavily. And so when you're on one fire and you're looking at one situation, we call that a case study. Okay, so in this case, we saw that a lot of clear cuts didn't burn. And you look at other patterns, and we saw these other events where other green patches didn't burn that had nothing to do with past harvesting or management. And it had to do with the flow of fire and how it ran up the landscape, where its origin was, what the wind speed was at the time. And so reconstructing how things happened gets a little difficult, because when these things are really cooking, nobody's there monitoring and measuring. You know, that we have some satellite or some infrared imagery. But so trying to reconstruct what happened and why is a real interesting puzzle. And you start looking at it. Well, we looked at the Sula Basin, which was largely a fuel-driven fire. And we looked at this, and this is actually a year after, and the Sula had already been salvage logged. But, you know, anything that wasn't merchantable got left, so you still see where there's green trees and where there's not. And so the obvious right there is a boundary line. That's the Shiny Mountain Ranch bordering the Sula National Forest. And so the Shiny Mountain Ranch had done a lot of thinning because they're grazing cows. They don't want understory trees. So they had an open stand of ponderosa pine that didn't burn as a crown fire. But even more intriguing was these islands of green trees in the middle. Why didn't those burn? Because when we went into the burn, and this is 3 weeks after the fire blew through there, this is what the forest looked like. It was pretty hot, okay? And there wasn't a whole lot that survived, and even some of the dead woody debris that sometimes doesn't burn because it's wet was consumed, so the white ash was where a big log burned up, okay? Well, when we got into those green islands, this is what we saw. And for one, they had been thinned, and for two, the woody debris in them had been cleaned up, okay? So the fire couldn't pass from crown to crown because this wasn't a wind-driven fire, it was a fuel-driven fire. So it dropped to the ground and it burned where there were fuels out there. And if there's a fuel concentration next to a big pea pine, it damaged the big pea pines too. And this tree eventually did die. It took about 3 or 4 years to die. And as a matter of fact, a lot of big old trees died because they're kind of in a maintenance phase. And so, you know, this is one of those trees that you watch over time. So there's 4 years later, there's 18 years later, now it's dead, and you see a little bit of the regeneration. So where an overstory survived, you got lots of natural regeneration. Often too much, more than you necessarily wanted. Well, the other thing is, again, if you go to the fence line, here's the Shiny Mountain Ranch to the right, the Sula on the left, that had been salvage logged, but the Shiny Mountain Ranch also salvage logged all their dead trees. And so if you pan to the left from here, there's the Sula, and if you pan to the right from the fence line, there's the Shiny Mountain Ranch. And so if you're there right after the fire, those trees that are missing there didn't torch out. The heat from the Sula crown fire generated enough radiation to scorch the trees on the edge of the Shiny Mountain Ranch to kill them. And so they removed them. But it scorched them out about 50 yards, and then it dropped to the ground. And this is a year later. So the black patch is where the trees were dense, there wasn't a whole lot of understory grass, and so nothing came back real strongly there. And just to put this into perspective, this is that same area, but panned more to the right, right after the fire. The entire basin burned. Okay, so it wasn't like fire didn't go through that other area. It had just dropped to the ground, went through the grass, and of course grass recovers really well. Well, that same year, the upper 9 Mile also burned. So in the 9 Mile Valley, north of Missoula, had heavy forest management activities in the past. So I went up there and looked at that as well, because what's going on up here? And so you start to see that these old clear cuts there also did not burn terribly well. And the more you looked, the more you saw. So, you know, larch showed tremendous resistance and resilience to the fire. Here's an old clear cut to the front. It didn't carry fire. Everything above the clear cut was black and dead. And if we look there in the distance, you know, this was like a raging crown fire, and it just didn't burn the clear cut. So this became a phenomenon that some friends and I labeled clear cuts don't burn phenomenon. But again, so here's a couple of fires. These are still case studies. And so, you know, fire does weird stuff. And just, you know, also to follow up on this in the upper 9 mile, so this is above that clear cut. Dead trees fall over time. Where it burned in the understory, dead trees also fall over time. And so, you know, 10 years later, you know, you do have regeneration, but you also have an impenetrable matrix of fallen over trees in there, okay? Now, compare that. This is Ralph Thisted. Thisted property was, he's got a section of land smack dab in the middle of the upper 9 Mile Valley, and he had done some management and thinned it. And so the fire hit his property, and it burned pretty mixed severity. And where there was fuel on the ground, it killed some big trees. And we saw this tremendous bloom of pine grass afterwards. But we also saw across this property this amazing regeneration of larch after the fire. So, you know, larch is a little bit like lodgepole pine, except for it doesn't have serotinous cones. It just has light seeds that will fly miles across the landscape and seed in an area. So obviously there was a larch overstory. The understory burned here, and the larch regeneration was phenomenal. Actually, it's a problem because we're looking at spacing of about 2 feet between these trees. And that original picture of Ralph standing next to the stump, well, that's what it looks like now. So, you know, where overstory trees survive, you get lots of natural regeneration after a fire, often too much. Now, in the undisturbed areas, it was kind of patchy. So the seed source is gone. You didn't get regeneration. You did get larch flying in from place to place. The other thing we saw is evergreen ceanothus, which is a nitrogen-fixing shrub, which has actually been shown to store its seeds in the duff layer for up to 200 years. And so where there was no evergreen ceanothus before, we saw evergreen ceanothus pop up everywhere and form these dense patches of it, which is a good thing because it's putting nitrogen into the ground. It's building soil in a pretty depleted soil. And so, you know, what you see are either the trees regenerating or either have serotinous cones like lodgepole pine, or they have light seed that fly in. Okay? Every other species on these crown fires was eliminated. Okay? We'll move on to the Fridley fire of 2001. Just outside of Bozeman. Burned 25,000 acres in a matter of days. That's it's cooking along. And I got called up by ranchers saying, what do I do with my land? I had 3,000 acres burn up. So I said, well, I'll meet you. Let's go up take a look. And so this was the view that greeted me. This is all his land right there. So it's black. And if you drive down into this, on this hillside in front of you, this fire had some severe impacts. I mean, you had fire tornadoes develop in here with the landscape that basically not only burned the tops of these trees, it uprooted trees. I wouldn't have wanted to be there when that was burning. Okay? But some other intriguing things that we saw when we looked across the landscape is he was very proud of the elk herd that was on his land. He grazed this. This was summer cattle pasture. He had 1,000 cows up there that he was given 12-hour notice to move out. So he said basically the hairs of the back of his head were singeing off as he was moving cows off of here. Because this was a flame front that came over the top of this mountain of almost biblical proportions. But the thing that struck me right off the bat is right in the center you see these little green patches. And I said, well, Richard, have you done any harvesting? He said, well, you know, I really didn't want to do too much. So we did a few small little patches when somebody needed some lodgepole for building a log cabin, this and that. So he said, I've got a 5-acre patch and a 10-acre patch that we harvested. That's what you're looking at. And I said, well, let's take a closer look at that. Why on earth did that not burn? So you approach it, and the edges are pretty scorched. But the center is green on those. And these are small little patches. And imagine the flame. I mean, you had 300-foot wall of flame come through here in the lodgepole pine. And this 5-acre and 10-acre patch didn't burn. And so this is another site where I looked a little further. So this is the bulk of the Fridley. It was on a wilderness study area. So where it started was a checkerboard, and it burned in a checkerboard. Then it got in the wilderness study area, and it's one big black patch. But then when it hit the northeast flank, and this is the edge of the Kinkeys property, where it hit these irregular shaped clear cuts, it dropped to the ground. There's no fire suppression there, by the way. I mean, they kind of backed off because this sucker was dangerous. So it came to the ground, started snaking around, and it burned through the grass, and then they could get some tankers in there and start putting it out on the edges. So this is a site that I've monitored over the years because I'm pretty intrigued, and my advice to them is log this as soon as you can. Because there's a lot of area that burned, and as soon as, if you can get a contract for your logs, then you're going to beat the competition because it's going to be flooded with salvage logs. And he did pretty well, but he actually did real well. But I came back. He gave me permission to visit his land anytime I want to. So a year later, I went up there to see how things were looking, and so there's another view of that green patch. And so periodically I get up there just to monitor what's going on. And so there's his property again from the same vista. I totally agree with Dr. Mark Finney that repeat photography is extremely valuable. So let me get my laser pointer here. So you see these little green patches there? Okay, so this is now 13 years later, and there's one of those little green patches. Okay, now again, imagine 300-foot walls of flame. You would not have wanted to be there, right? But here's the real intriguing thing about this. As you look at these, this is the only place where you'll find subalpine fir and Douglas fir. Okay? The rest of this landscape has been reduced to a lodgepole pine monoculture. Okay? Nothing else survived. The seeds of those species are gone, except for these little islands that are out there. Okay? So there's, again, looking at what you have there. And these are skid trails, so, you know, logging does disrupt some of the lodgepole pine seed, but considering what's there, not a big loss. Actually, he's got way too many trees and needs to thin them at this point. But we compare, he salvage logged all of his 3,000 acres, but next to Forest Service land. So it gives a good comparison of what that ground looks like. And again, regeneration is a little patchier. And it's a lot harder to get around because this stuff has fallen over. And I kind of crawled in here, and all of a sudden, excuse my French, all heck broke loose in front of me. I thought, oh my God, Richard just told me about a big grizzly bear that killed a couple of his cows, and here I am in this stuff, and I bumped into the grizzly bear. It was a big mule deer doe that had tried to get up and got tangled in all the underbrush. And, but anyways, one of those memorable experiences. So there's another example where these clear cuts, these little itty-bitty clear cuts, didn't burn for some reason or another. Well, move on to the Helena. A lot of the Helena burned, and we saw the effects of thinning. But again, we saw these clear cuts that didn't burn up in there, even though it was a pretty good crown fire that moved through there. Didn't take a lot of pictures. Well, move on to 2003 and the Moose Fire north of Kalispell. So we're covering a big geographic range here. Okay, we're now in the wet, productive forest types north of Kalispell. And of course, the pattern here is mostly lodgepole pine. So this has burned like this before. This is within the historic range of variability that other people have talked about. Lodgepole pine grows fast, reaches about 100 years of age, becomes susceptible to mountain pine beetle, and promotes fire because fire promotes lodgepole pine. It's going to set the stage for its regeneration. But again, when we looked on here, we looked at management areas, clear cuts. So this area right in front is an old clear cut. This is a recent clear cut, and it had a pretty profound impact on fire behavior even. But where Mark is mainly interested in fire behavior, I mean he's interested in other stuff, but what he's talking about is fire progression across the landscape. I'm interested in what the fire leaves behind. Okay, so it burns through an area. What does it do to the landscape? What does it do to the overall ecology? And something else we learned there is in these big areas, there were areas that didn't burn. When we look closer, it's larch. Okay, larch and lodgepole pine are somewhat equivalent but different strategies. Lodgepole pine has serotinous cones, so its seeds will survive the fire. Larch, as a mature tree, has this unique ability to survive in some capacity or another the most horrific fires. And then one larch tree with its little bitty seeds can reseed the entire area again. Different strategy, but also very, very successful. Okay, so moving on, looked at a lot of other fires, but one that's really noticeable was the Roaring Lion Fire. Okay, and if you haven't seen the video, Google Roaring Lion Fire, because they had an osprey nest with a camera on it, and it really showed the progression of this fire over 8 hours. And it's a fire tornado. I mean, truly a fire tornado. And it roared across this mountainside. Well, I got involved because, as one of my things is the stewardship program, where we help landowners assess and develop forest management plans. And we had some stewardship graduates right there. And I said, you know, we got impacted by the fire. Could you please come down and take a look? And I said, sure, because I want to see what happened there. You know, I'm wanting to learn more. And so we got on this landowner's property. And so this is pretty small to see, but I blow it up. I just wanted to give you the panorama. So we walked along the property line. So if I open it up, so this is looking north, this is Forest Service. This is the boundary of Forest Service and the private landowner that had thinned their property. And then just looking to the left, this is their thin property. So you have this fire tornado moving across the mountainside to hit the thinned area. It still burned through it, but it dropped to the understory. And yeah, she lost some trees on there, but for the most part, that fire was intact. So management does matter. It does influence fire behavior, but more importantly to me, it influences what's left behind. Okay, we're going to see fires. We're going to see them under multiple different circumstances. So how do we stack the odds that what we want stays on the landscape and doesn't simplify? Now, move on, and now things get even more interesting. So another stewardship grad after the Sunrise Mountain Fire called up and said, can you come look at my place? And again, I'm eager to learn. So these are case studies to figure out what happened on here. So this is his property. And he had just thinned it all and was in the process of logging. So there were log decks on the side of the road. Otherwise, most of the slash had been cleaned up. And I kind of looked at that and said, that doesn't make sense why that burned. Well, I got up further than the Sunrise Mountain Fire because it started way up the top on Sunrise Mountain itself. And this is real close. But again, a little bit different fire behavior because this is a grand fir, subalpine fir forest type. So this little patch down here, this is a clear cut that again did not burn. And I investigated, walked around and said, well, I wonder what's going on here. This is a different fire. It was a severe understory fire. It wasn't in the crowns of trees here. Now, it was in certain places, but right here it was an understory fire. And you had very, very thick, these are productive forests, very, very thick duff layers, 12 inches almost of duff material. This is an elk track going through the ash, 6 inches of ash over the mineral soil there. And it's just, the ash loves water, it gets super water saturated, and it doesn't let water through, so the soil underneath that is bone dry. So, but it gives you a little idea. And here's another vision of that clear cut. So that fire raged all around it, okay? Everything pretty severe, but it couldn't really burn across the clear cut again. Starting to see a little bit of a pattern here. Haven't quite figured out what it is, but I know there's a pattern there somewhere. Well, I looked at other areas, and this baffled me a little bit. Okay, so you have a mosaic of different structures, so you have a mosaic of fire there. Okay, that kind of makes sense. Went back to the lower Ponderosa pine forest that had all burned, and talked to the landowner some more. And he was actually in Spokane at the time. His wife had terminal cancer, and he was there. But I talked to the neighbors a bit, and the neighbors had actually taken some video and some pictures. So this is the fire, and this right here is the access road. And what you're actually seeing there is a fire crew doing a burnout on there. Okay, so the fire was still way up on the mountain, and they decided we're going to do what affectionately now is called box burning. We're going to go back down to areas where we can safely set a fire, and we're going to create this big black zone around the Sunrise Mountain Fire because it might come off this mountaintop and burn down into the wildland-urban interface. And this is their progression moving down the road. And you see these individual hot spots, and they're really cooking back here. You know what those are? Those are his log decks that they lit on fire as they're going down. Okay, now needless to say, the landowner was hopping mad because he had $30,000 in log decks up there that disappeared, and no recourse. I mean, other than to sue the Forest Service on here. So we're starting to see something else going on here. Well, let's move on to everybody's favorite, the Lolo Peak Fire, which, you know, was a real doozy. And, you know, Justin and I, a couple years, this is, I think, 3 years after the fire. Justin, is that correct? We went up on Carlton Ridge. On top of Carlton Ridge was the largest stand of subalpine larch, and we were really curious how that had survived the fire. Well, this is climbing up there, and I tell you what, all the fires I've looked at over 30 years, this is the most severe fire impact I have ever seen. And it, again, didn't make much sense to me. This is 3 years after the fire, what we're looking at. 3 years after the fire. So, and yeah, there's Justin, you know, we went up there and found that a lot of the subalpine larch had cooked off as well. There were remnants of it. I don't know, I'd guess 10 to 25% maybe. Justin's doing research up there, so maybe next year he'll talk about that. Okay, but just to give you an idea, so this fire started at the top of Lolo Peak and was burning around up there. And when it got into these drainages, we got severe fire effects. But there's more to this story, of course. So there's a landowner who had sold off his sub-sandwich franchise and bought 8 sections of former Plum Creek land on the north side of Lolo Peak. And these were every other checkerboard. So this is a section. This is part of a section. And he asked me to come up and help him do a fire assessment. And so we were looking at this, and if you look at this, there's something weird looking about that. Let's take a closer look. It's got zebra stripes on it, okay? And it turns out what those zebra stripes are is a massive burnout operation started down on the highway, okay? And these zebra stripes were helicopter passes dropping ignition devices, ping pong balls, trying to light his clear cuts on fire to create a black zone because the Lolo Peak fire is still up here. But the model said that a front was coming in, a red flag day, and it was going to blow this fire across Lolo Peak down into the town of Missoula, town of Lolo. So we're going to create this big black zone around it to prevent that from happening. Well, he's got 8 sections of land that got burned up. Not from the fire coming down, but from the fire coming up. And here's just another part of his land. And we'll go even further down. We'll go down right next to the highway. So this is another stewardship grad, private landowner, who had gone through the class, learned all about fire and thinning, and had thinned all of their property. Okay? And it became the perfect anchor point for a burnout operation. So they torched off this landowner's property to create a black zone. Now, if you brought the landowner here to talk about this, when they got done choking up, they'd have a lot of expletives to declare because they're madder than hell about this. So here's a new element of fire introduced onto managed grounds. And to really put the icing on the cake, you may have seen this picture. This picture was actually given to me by this homeowner who had taken the picture. This is 3 in the afternoon, and that fire is a burnout activity where it got lit right behind their house to create that black zone. Okay? So we go back to these extreme draw and extreme fire events. They were extreme because the fire started at the base, ran up the mountainside. All those hot gases were preheating those trees, driving off all the moisture. So when the actual flame front hit them, they were bone dry and they just really cooked pretty hard. So the problem is trying to discern this is burnouts are not mapped differently than progression of natural fire. So it's really hard on any fire map to determine where the origin of the fire was, how the fire was moving, and therefore figure out how the fire was moving through different fuels, because a backing fire is going to burn very differently than a fire going up the slope. So this is just something that adds to the difficulty of analyzing what the heck's going on in these landscapes and what's going to survive and what isn't. Because if you're preparing for a fire to back down the mountain, and thinning will work probably quite beautifully as it did on the Roaring Lion fire. But if someone lights a fire at the toe of the slope and it burns through your thin ground, the fire behavior is going to be quite different, okay? And the impacts are going to be different. All right, well, I saved the best for the last here. So I travel around the state, work with landowners, county agents, etc. So I was working in Marr County out of White Sulphur Springs with a large ranch landowner who was trying to figure out what to do with their forest, and they own quite a bit of forest land. So I spent the day with them, and because I'm interested in ecology and landscapes, I drove over the big belts, up over Gypsy Lake, over to Townsend via this mountain pass right here, only it wasn't lit at the time. I'd be really stupid to drive up there when this was going on, but this is the Woods Creek Fire, and you can see multiple ignitions on there, right? Well, the year before, I had driven up over that pass out of interest. And so here's my trip up over the pass, and I'd taken a bunch of pictures because as I got up there, I saw some really interesting contrasts, and that's why I took the pictures. Because the original forest was 50% dead from spruce budworm, mountain pine beetle, drought. These were late successional stands, you know, they just don't live, they had exceeded their capacity to live on the landscape. They needed way more water than was being resupplied. So this is ranch land where they had done some clear cutting on there, okay? So as I went over the pass, I took various pictures because, wow, this is cool stuff and I can use this in a class at some point in time. I didn't know that the very next year this whole thing would burn off. So I got permission to go up there while it was still closed off, and they said, you're not going to find anything up there, it's all black. Well, here's going up, here's the next year. Okay, now it gets better. Going up to the pass, so this is what I saw when I went up there. Now this is really intriguing because this is next year. Okay, now you see this clear cut, this fire like a river going up here. To the right of this picture is a deep drainage. And the fire got in the base of that and it made a run up the drainage. We call that a chimney. Okay? And those hot gases had gone up here, preheated all this, and because they preheated it, they drove the moisture out of the fuel, out of the needles, and the fire ripped across there. So clear cuts do burn occasionally with enough preparation and the right circumstances. Okay? Well, continuing up, here's right at the top of the pass. So I took this because this is literally the forest from hell. Okay? You don't get higher fuel loadings than this. And quite predictably, when the fire hit that, that's what it looked like. Okay? It was black, toasty, and there was nothing alive there. Period. And with the exception of a few lodgepole pine that might have been in there, the seed source was also totally destroyed. Okay? I took some understory pictures because I was just looking at, oh my God, this is a poster child of why you need to do some fuel reduction work, right? Well, there's before, there's after. Gee, that's not predictable, right? Okay. Well, there's also lodgepole pine patches that, you know, you look at them, they don't look that flammable, but if there's enough heat hitting them, and this did not torch out. This is not a crown fire. This is just pretty severe understory fire. Okay? Well, I got up onto a ridge and gave me a little bit of a landscape perspective known as the basin. Okay? So that was the year before, and it was very beautiful, and there was a bull elk bugling off in the distance. I was in seventh heaven. I mean, because look at all this cool stuff going on there. Well, following year, that's what it looks like. Now, isn't it interesting that these clear cuts did not burn? Now, you recall Mark said this morning that these checkerboard past management units didn't matter. Well, they mattered because this is what's left behind. Okay? Like on the Fridley fire, had none of this been in place, you would have had an extremely simplified ecosystem. Because the only thing there that would come back from this kind of fire is lodgepole pine. You lose all of the diversity out of that system. But, you know, we want a mosaic out there. Okay? Fire is not necessarily bad, it's not necessarily good, it's a change, but we don't want to lose it all. Okay? So, here's another one. Okay? You know, this green, vibrant green clear-cut patch surrounded by this pretty old late successional forest. Boom, following year. Okay? So, and where you see, okay, the black patches, yeah, the trees are dead, but what about the not green patches? Okay, it didn't all burn. Well, it actually did. If you go in the understory, all these trees are dead. It was just an understory fire, very severe. And to give you a visual perspective, as you approach the clear cut, you can see that the edges got toasted because of all that radiant heat there. If you'd have been standing there, you'd be dead. okay? But the interior of the clear cuts did not burn, okay? You know, some final hoorahs on here. Again, another perspective, and this area up in the back, that's a proposed wilderness area, by the way. But again, another view of the basin after the fire. So when you see this in one setting, that's a case study. When you see it on multiple settings, it's a trend. When you see it on every single fire in the Northern Rockies, it's a data set, okay? And in case you doubt me that, oh, this is just random, standing on this ridge, look the other way, there's a whole drainage that had no management, okay? That's what it looked like, because that's impressive. It's after the fire, okay? No green squares in there, okay? So there's some very clear evidence here that something's going on there that is impacting fire behavior. And it's not, I mean, there's two stories to this. One is, how do we contain these fires from burning into assets of value? But the second thing is, that these fires burn, are we losing ecosystems? Okay? And I would argue that when you take an ecosystem that has multiple tree species and you convert it to a single monoculture of tree species, such as lodgepole pine, you're losing something out of that. Okay, and so how do we prevent that? Well, other side of the mountains, a lot of private landowners met with this ranch. They own about just a mere 15,000 acres there. So they took me up there. This had all burned, the grass had come back, but they wanted to show me this because they had thinned this forest. And all of this had burned, okay? It was just black grass. This is the following year when I was up there with them. But if you see on the right-hand corner, there's some black right there. Let's take a closer look at that. Intriguing story there, because this is an isolated, landlocked piece of Forest Service. And when they thinned their pasture land, they said, can we thin yours as well? Won't cost you a penny, we'll just do it. And the Forest Service said, no, you can't. Well, it's now a black square section on the landscape. But let's go back, again, look at that. And so we see the black. But what about the green? Did that survive the fire? Well, let's take a look. That's the understory. That's a cambium the way it should not look. It's dead. So that green you see on that landscape was also dead. It was just severe understory. You go up there now, that whole mountainside is dead trees, with the exception of where those past harvest units were. So what's behind all this? Well, there's actually, and you get in the literature, there's plenty of data that looks at this. Fire's been pretty intensively studied now for the last 30 years. So here we had a control. This is multiple sites. This is a study that was done. I just put up this graph. This is a control, and what they're using, how do you judge fire risk, is by wind speed. How much wind speed do you need to get the fire in the crowns of trees? Okay? The higher the wind speed, the more fire resistant it is. Okay? So here's the control where you do nothing. It took about a 20-mile-an-hour wind speed to get into the crown fire. Here's a thin and make piles of debris. You need a lot of wind. Okay, that's pretty fire resistant. Here's thin and scatter the debris. Enough woody debris that fire still cooks through there. Okay. Here's a different site where the piles still contributed enough. There's enough density, enough heat to the system that you still 40-mile-an-hour wind speed. And so on, but we get back to this one. Here's the control. Here's a different site, piles. You can see takes a lot. So here's a one data set that tells you that thinning makes a difference. But it's not just the fuel, the amount of fuel. A big part of this is the condition of the fuel. So this is one of those terms we use, water potential. It's how much pressure do you need to put on a twig to squeeze water out of it. It tells you how hydrated it is. Okay? So in cropping it's called wilting point. So permanent wilting point when crops die is at minus 1.5, so right about there. Okay, so and what we have here is the black is a control, then a thin and burn, and another thin and a different kind of burn configuration. So in June, there's a lot of water in the soil. Okay, minus 0.8 megapascals. It's fairly moist soil. Okay, about 1.5 is where it really dries out. When we move to July, look at where the control is. Okay, it's at minus 1.2, getting real close to where trees can't extract water anymore. So this is July 29th, 30th. When trees can't extract water anymore, they're really drying down. And fire behavior people will tell you that live fuel moisture is huge. Because the more, for something to burn, you have to drive the water out of it first. The more water in a needle, the longer it takes, the more heat it takes to make it flammable. So this gives us an idea of why those clear cuts aren't burning. They don't have as much leaf area, they're not using as much water, the foliage stays hydrated longer into the season, and the fire can't burn into them because the needles are too wet. Okay? Whereas these dense canopy forests have 3 times as much canopy, they go through the water 3 times as fast, plus they intercept rainfall and snowfall so they don't get the water recharge in the soil. So they're really drought stressed. So look at some other things, some other studies that I just threw out here. And this goes to the pattern of treatments across the landscape, which is a very intriguing and important landscape planning process. They call them SPLATs, strategically placed landscape area treatments. Okay, and in the modeling, and Mark Finney has done a lot of this. Some of his seminal work is arrangement of fuel treatments across the landscape and slowing down or changing fire behavior. And in the modeling, it shows a pretty big effect. One of his papers shows that you only need to impact, oh gosh, I forget what the percentage is. It's ridiculously low, 5% of the landscape to start having an impact on fire progression on here. We read this down here. The amount of strategically placed landscape area treatments seems to affect the ability of fire to burn across the landscape more than treatment type. Okay, so this is making an argument for developing a mosaic to change fire behavior across the landscapes. All right, and how effective are these treatments? Well, here's another paper. This is really a great paper where it looked at a large burned area. 2007 was one of the most severe fire years in Idaho in the Payette National Forest, an area I'm also very familiar with. But the main thing off here is that treatments were estimated to decrease wildfire extent 79 to 74% in the wildfires they evaluated, and the impact or the longevity of treatments was 20 to 40 years. Now, anecdotally, looking at all these things, if it's a clear cut that's 30 years and younger, it doesn't seem to burn. You hit that magical 30 years, all of a sudden your leaf area is high enough, your trees are big enough, the crowns are intermingled, you're starting to see them dry down and they tend to burn. Okay, and this is simply the trees growing on that site. Now, generic rules are inherently dangerous because across the United States we have different ecologies in these forests, which means different fire patterns of fire behavior, high humidity, low humidity, different vegetations. California is my nightmare because it has manzanita, which is like our brush soaked in diesel fuel, okay, and its flammability. So I'm talking about Northern Rockies, okay. If you do a clear cut down in California, it's immediately full of manzanita, so clear cuts there are much more flammable. So you can't make the general statement that clear cuts don't burn. Clear cuts in the Northern Rockies seem to be much more fire resistant, okay. This is Northern Rockies. We have different climate here, and so it gets really messy when people try to generalize across the entire United States. I just wanted to bring that up. So here's another really comprehensive piece of work. So I mentioned the fires of 2007 in Idaho that burned through the Payette National Forest. Well, there had been some fuel treatment studies down there. There's a map of them, okay, and they got burned over from the fire of the century across the Payette. Okay, this was 1910 type fire behavior. So there's the treatment map. This is after it burned. The red is the severe, the green is no fire effect. And you can see the treatment areas. So this is very, very similar to what we've been seeing across all these different fires, only with clear cuts, but also with thinning on the roaring lion fire. You alter the fuels, the fire may go around it. I mean, it's just like a Plinko board. You know, the fire is just going around obstacles and keeps on going, which I think was Mark's point this morning. But what it leaves behind, we can dramatically impact by what we do with not only the vegetation type, but the fuel loading on those different sites. So there's just some aerial views of that study area, and so it's these green patches surrounded by black. Why didn't they burn? Well, they had been thinned, and we go into the physiological literature, they probably didn't burn, and I don't know this because I didn't measure it, but I'm going to speculate, because the live fuel moisture was too high for them to ignite. There's just required too much energy to drive the water off. So water boils at 212 degrees Fahrenheit, okay? Ignition occurs at close to 600 degrees Fahrenheit. Ignition won't occur until all the water's gone, right? So pretty simple math. So when we look at these landscapes on the larger picture, and we know exactly what we're going to find in the understory, there is a solution other than just lighting the damn thing on fire and having fire do the work for us, okay? And so my argument at this point, after 30 years of looking at these patterns across the landscape and seeing the same thing over and over and over and over again, is that fuel manipulations in the form of tree harvesting, which, by the way, earns money, doesn't cost money, okay? This made a sawmill money. This produced wood for your house, okay? And at the same time, it created diversity on the landscape. So all around this, you know it's going to come back, either nothing or lodgepole pine. And in this clear cut, you have subalpine fir, spruce, lodgepole pine, maybe even white pine, maybe even white bark pine. What I didn't show you on those pictures of the Big Belt Mountains is there was a huge stand of limber pine up in there, really big limber pine. They're all dead. I mean, they just got toasted off of there, just in the black. So, there are things that we can do beyond. Fire is a beautiful tool. It's going to occur on the landscape because we have hot, dry summers and we have ignition sources, okay? That's a no-brainer. But we can have a profound impact on how that fire is going to burn across the landscape. And it's not just the wildland-urban interface, because we're talking about ecosystems, about biological diversity, not just, okay, stopping the fire from burning down someone's house. All right, so there's my 30 years of experience of looking at different fire sites. Picture's worth 1,000 words. To me, there's some clear solutions here. And so with that, I'll answer any questions anybody may have.
I was just thinking, mentioned some of the guys this morning, site preparation techniques and everything have changed a lot over time. We used to, back in the day, we used to have Forest Service prescriptions that talked about piling almost every acre. There was trampling involved. We left a certain number of tonnage per acres, but there was a lot of disturbance back then in the understory. And when I heard this morning, about duff layers and persistent duff layers and things moving across landscapes can be pretty detrimental. We saw that in Fridley fire too, or not Fridley, but Bridger. With regard to what I call root mining in the duff layers and killing what looked to be live trees. But when you look at slash management over time, when we used to do all that piling and burning, you're kind of looking at some of the stands that I've seen here may have been different slash treatments rather than tree length harvesting per se. And I kind of wonder how much that might have to do with it. I agree with the moisture part too, but as far as that continuous duff layer, moving fire through a landscape.
Well, that's a great question. So if I may paraphrase, it's not just the trees, it's what's the surface fuels like, as in duff layers and all of that. And I think that's an extremely relevant point, and shown here, that even if you didn't have a crown fire, if you had the surface fuels, you still had severe fire effects out there. And yeah, it does matter. And a lot of these papers qualify that treated units, if activity fuels have been treated, seem to be or are much less flammable. Now, if you have a 100-mile-an-hour wind blowing that fire across, all bets are off. But all you're doing is increasing the probabilities that something will survive out there. And I am still, when I look at review those old pictures of Fridley fire in this 5-acre and 10-acre clear cuts, that the trees in there survived this wall of flame around it. And, you know, you see one of those fires and you just go, nothing is going to survive that. But, you know, if you're in the middle of that without a fire shelter, you probably would have survived unless you starved of oxygen because the fire took it all. But again, for me, there's two questions. Is really, how are we going to contain these fires to protect assets? But secondly, if these areas are going to burn, how are they going to burn and what is left behind? Okay? Each of these mountainsides has a genetic legacy. So the belts, these island mountain ranges, they've been isolated since the last ice age, 12,000 years. They have their own unique set of genetics out there. And if it all goes up like the South Moccasin fire did last year, the entire mountain burned off, that whole island mountain range. And the only thing that's going to come back is there was about 200 acres scattered lodgepole pine. And that's going to come back. But the ponderosa pine, the Doug fir on that site, it's dead, and the seed source is dead. So what a loss. So, you know, it's again, you kind of sometimes got to take the 20,000 foot view. Sometimes you got to take the 2-inch view. But there's multiple tools out here, and prescribed fire is one of them. But it's not the only tool. There's a lot of other tools out there. So, and that was just, you know, I have the unique opportunity to travel the state and get out on here because this is an interest area of mine to look at how these fires behave. And so I've been able to amass kind of a photographic perspective of these different fires. And I think it has some value when we think about fires as a landscape event.
It's not just a fire event either, it's all your bugs and clear cuts that were done 25 years ago today are green, and hundreds of thousands of acres beside those cuts are dead, lost, and then they're talking about elk cover. Well, if they had a checkerboard path, forest management should all be there.
Well, you look at this picture, and I chose this one for a reason. I mean, this is Music Broad fire. It's burned equivalent to the Valley Complex as well. So here's a harvest unit that was put in an irregular shape. Okay, visually it's quite different than a square on the landscape. You know, so going back and saying, hey, we're going to do more clear cutting to solve the fire problem is going to go over kind of like saying, we're bringing Putin over here to solve our problems, right? So, you know, we have to couch this in the appropriate terminology of what we're doing. We're not dozer piling and windrowing. You know, we are restoring irregular mosaics into the landscape. And again, you know, this brings back the bigger question. Is there some kind of natural equilibrium out there? Okay, it's more of a philosophical argument. I would say no. We have a landscape that is continually responding to climatic variability. Different species that gain advantages and disadvantages. There never is such of a thing as an equilibrium that we like to think of. What we want to see is trees and species continue to survive on the landscape and grow in a capacity that meets not only nature's needs, but our needs. And so there's a way to modify those things, and they take it even a bigger philosophical approach. We only exist because as a species, we've learned to modify our environment to support our population density. So, and these forests are important. This is the headwaters to the Missouri and the Mississippi and the Columbia. So, you know, I'm interested in being able to go up and hike and see forests and hike through some burned areas and hike through some green areas, but to see a continuation of the forest species legacy that's out there. So that's maybe a loftier goal. But again, these types of treatments don't cost us taxpayer dollars. They make us taxpayer dollars. And that also needs to be part of the equation, because how are you going to pay for all this stuff?
I think I'm going to channel Jeff Schmidt a little bit here. It depends on where you are if it's going to make you money or not.
Sure.
So, but I think it's just important to point that out. In some places, absolutely it will. In other places, it may not. And I bring it up because on the Red Lodge Mountain Project, they were cutting lodgepole that looks like, oh, this is all logs, but actually a lot of it's coal. And it ended up, that project, I think, was well worth doing. It's that ski area is really important for the town of Red Lodge, and it was a good fuel treatment, but in that case, it's costly.
Well, right now, if you're doing work out in the belts or out of Lewistown, you have to think about the price of fuel and whether you can afford to haul a load of logs from there to a sawmill. On the other hand, if you adopt this philosophy of landscape restoration using harvesting to restore the mosaic, somebody might think about investing more in their mill in a more local variety. There are small sawmills at Reed Point. Used to be one in Roundup. There's a startup up in the Bears Paw. He's on his 5th mill now. Started with a Wood-Mizer, and after breaking his back, he's all hydraulic now. So, but it all depends on if I'm going to invest $1 million in a small sawmill or $50 million in a bigger sawmill, and I have to pay it off over the next 20 years, is there 20 years of log supply? And if I looked at landscape and say, hey, we can get X% per year for the next 20 years, now I have a business model. So that kind of, that really taking it out to the broader perspective. But we have to consider all the tools out there. And of course, in my rail extension, again, I have one foot in how we think the world ought to be, and the other foot in the way the world really is. And so that's what we're trying to do, is try to find solutions that aren't just monospecific, because prescribed burning is a great tool if we can do it in a safe manner. But there's consequences. By prescribed burning, we might be promoting regeneration from hell. So it's not just do it and then now you're good. You're going to have to do it every 10 years. So anyways, just some other thoughts in here. Any other questions? Been a long day, so you're either all in awe or you're going, God, this is disgusting. Will you shut up? Okay.
Just a comment. So given that the literature is somewhat incomplete, or there's some disagreements, as you pointed out throughout your talk, how do agency practitioners put together defensible projects based on their experience, their knowledge, but also the literature on benefits of management, effectiveness, when we don't even agree fully on the topic, as you pointed out so well? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So the question is, how do agencies wade through all these differences in literature, etc., and all of that stuff? And as I'll tell the gentleman out there who's selling his hitch for the tractors, when he was asking me what could I do with this to make it more marketable, I said, ideas are cheap. Actually making it work is really hard. And I don't know. Sure, I can throw out a whole bunch of ideas, but it is very daunting, because it's become political, it's become a matter of perception. I don't know. There's people in here smarter than I am that could probably speak to that question better than I could.
They're cherry picking, as you know, from the literature, and they're pulling out things on treatment in the WUI should be confined to 30 feet outside the home and maybe nothing else. And it makes it difficult, I'm sure, for people trying to put together interface projects that have to deal with inconsistencies in the science.
Well, this has been a problem for the 30-some years that I've been in the profession. And it remains a problem. It's visibility, message. But, if we take harvesting out of the box of solutions and we're only left with fire, we're going to get what fire dishes us up. And we can have a profound impact on what fire dishes us up if we think of the whole integrated package together. And harvesting, in my opinion, of all the practical things I've looked at, is an incredibly important tool. It's just, rather than harvesting where we're going to make the most bucks, we need to harvest where we're going to make money and where it makes ecological sense. So it's really integrating the ecology with the management and the practice. And then, selling it to the public, that, especially on public lands. Now, you private landowners, it's a privilege to work with landowners, because it's also scary, because I do a workshop, landowners take this stuff, they go home, they start their chainsaw and start working. And, so, God, I don't want to have that responsibility either, So there's Johnny Appleseed and I'm Johnny Chainsaw, So, but Yeah, it's complicated, but not that complicated. We need to, I guess, the real message I want to impart is we need to integrate these management options together with the new understanding and use of fire on these landscapes. So, you get to go home now.